program. She also did a master's degree at Penn shortly thereafter, and has been involved, as Kristen said, in community development, housing, and on the margins of real estate development. And I think we'll talk about a number of those things. I want to say just a little bit more about our conversation tonight and in the series of conversations. We really targeted these initially to our current thesis students and our students last year who entered the job market, a terrible market, and really with the view that I would have a short conversation with some of our distinguished alum, and then kind of turn it over to questions, because this is a format where we can have a lot of our former students, our students, and others actually have a clear and direct and conversation with a distinguished alum, but also someone who is a real force in the industry and has accomplished a lot already, and may have some advice for our applicants, and may have advice for all of us about a variety of things. So I'm going to have a small conversation with Tya, ask her a couple of questions. If any of you have questions as we kind of move through the brief conversation, just post them if you would in chat. Tya and I can both see them. And then at some point we'll just open it up to to students or to anyone who has a question, and we can just have a direct conversation with Tya. We won't keep Tya all night. We'll try to go for about an hour, maybe a little longer. So I'll stop there. And just say thank you again, Tya. Tya is currently the Executive Director of Community Design Collaborative in Philadelphia. She also was more recently with Habitat for Humanity in Philadelphia. She's worked with the Philly Housing Authority, and is teaching currently, I believe, only at Temple, or also at
Jefferson. So Temple
at Jefferson as well, and is involved in, was very, very involved in the National NOMA conference, which I think she was deeply, deeply engaged in planning. And I'm not going to say any more, except thrilled to have you. I don't know, Ty, if there's anything after all, I've already been talking for 5 minutes. Maybe one thing I would maybe just start with asking is you graduated here in 2009. Why'd you come here, and what happened? I know when you were here, you were very involved in a number of student organizations, which you also have helped kind of re-engage our current chapters with at the national level. Maybe, what was it like when you came to Syracuse? And we'll start with that.
Sure, we can start there. Well, hi everyone. It's good to kind of meet all of you on Zoom. Like the dean said, I graduated in 2009, so I was starting to look at architecture school around. I probably started looking in 2002 as a sophomore in high school. But I had known I wanted to be an architect since I was in kindergarten, and I had the luck of having a mom that was like very into supporting whatever I was into. So I had done a lot of summer programs, and like I grew up in Chicago. So there was a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright kid programs in Chicago when I was growing up. So I had spent a lot of time, with architecture. I'm putting it in quotes because once you get to architecture school, as you guys all know, it's not at all what you thought it was before you got to architecture school. And as a youngster, actually, I really thought I was going to go to MIT. Like that, like since I was like probably in preschool, like people used to ask me, where are you going next year for kindergarten? I would tell them MIT for architecture. And they were like, oh, okay. And so going through high school, I was a pretty competitive high school. I was like, okay, I'm going to go to MIT. Like I wasn't even looking at other schools. And I think closer to, I had a counselor that was like, oh, MIT is really more about robotics, and she was really trying to talk me out of it. And I think I did a thing that they had in Chicago for students, and I realized that their architecture program was 6 years for their BArch at the time. And so then somebody mentioned, like, "Oh, you should look at other programs." And so when I started looking at other programs, we had a family friend, a really, really close family friend who was at Syracuse at the time. And we had my godparents would go visit her every year because they have family in and out of Rochester. So they would always drive through Syracuse on their way to visit this family friend. And they were like, "Oh, you should really look at Syracuse." So Syracuse happened to be doing a day at my high school. And so I just kind of like met with the recruiter, and they let me know, because it wasn't a person from architecture, of course, it was somebody from the university as a whole. But they were like, "We don't know much about architecture, but here's like all the information in this, like, archaic pamphlet and folder," which is what you used to get when you did college admissions, about the architecture program. And the architecture program was 5 years. And I was like, wait, that's 1 year less than MIT. So now I got to start looking at other places. And I applied early decision because through this family friend, she like 100% convinced me, like, go to Syracuse. I was a basketball fan, right? I grew up in Chicago in the 90s. It was the era of Michael Jordan. I don't know if you guys know, but in 2003, Syracuse won the NCAA tournament. So I was like, oh, I wanted to go to a basketball school. I wanted to go to a school that had a good architecture program. At the time, Syracuse was ranked 2 in the country. And so it seemed like a no-brainer. I applied early action. And then when I got in, I applied to many other schools. I probably applied to like 12 schools, a few Ivies, a few not, and another big name school that is often in competition with Syracuse. And so my mom was like, "Okay, well, I'm not just going to send you to upstate New York without you having ever been up there. It's really cold." And I was like, "Well, Chicago's really cold." And so we went on a family trip, and we did Syracuse, we did Ithaca, and we looked at RPI. And I mean, you guys are already at Syracuse, so I don't have to like, well, I guess some of you might not be, but RPI was not very fun, and I didn't really like any of their facilities. Cornell was a little too intense and scary and quiet and weird. And I had the most fun at Syracuse for the week. It aligned with the university program where you got like hooked up with another student. Of course, I got hooked up with a non-architecture student, and it was like the best time I think I had ever had in my life up to that point. I'm still friends with some of the people that I met that weekend, and I was told, I was like, "Oh, I'm going to Syracuse." So that was like my how I got to Syracuse story.
Wow, great story. And when you got here, I mean, we've talked about this before, and maybe we'll return to this. What was the student body like at that time? Because obviously we're all very mindful of the lack of diversity in the profession at large, and certainly at schools of architecture, and our school is no different than many others. What was it like at that time?
Let's see, what was it like? So in my class of over 100 freshman year, I was the only Black female. And I think in the whole building, there was 2.5. There was a girl that was in 3rd year, but I think she was kind of like in and out of architecture. She was one of those, she couldn't really decide what she wanted to do. And so she was actually not like in classes the semester I started. And then there was a grad student that ended up being my TA freshman year for Terrence Good's class. And I think she's half Black. So like that was like, I walked into a situation where I don't think I had ever been used to being like that small of a number in my life. And so it was definitely an adjustment, but I feel like we had a really good team. At the time, there was the peer advisor group was really great. Do they still do peer advising?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So I had a really great
actually, Tya, I think we have a lot of peer advisors on tonight. I see
Oh, okay.
3 or 4.
I was a peer
right
advisor
now.
too in 2006. So I had a really great peer advisor. She was actually on the university poster right the week before me earlier this year, Emily. So I feel like I really connected with Emily. There were some girls that were probably 2 years ahead of me that had started the Women in Architecture student organization, and they were really active. And so they were really great at getting most of the women in a freshman class kind of really involved. There was a group at the time. I know you guys have NOMAS now, but NOMA actually, we didn't start the NOMAS chapter until my last year at Syracuse, but there was a group before NOMAS called the Society of Multicultural Architects and Designers. It was started by a student that was a few years older than me, but I had met him when I visited Syracuse to kind of look at the school. And so I already knew him. And so when I showed up, he was like, oh, you guys came, I have your back. So that's Oswaldo. A few of you, he actually spoke at another event a few weeks ago. So you guys might know him as well. And so I feel like we kind of had like a really good core group, friends and family within the class. I would say in my class of like BIPOC students, there was probably 11. This included some international students. So like definitely not the makeup that you see today in most architecture schools in the country. And so I think having lower numbers of even like international students, that was like the family, right? It was a bunch of Asian Americans from New York. There were a few from California. It was me and two other African American students, one that was actually older and was coming back from doing military service in Iraq. And then we had two international students from, I think one was Korean and one was from Tokyo. And then we had 3 Puerto Rican international students, because at that time, Puerto Rico was still an international student. So I think we got really close. And I think that was one of the things that kind of helped us all get through freshman and really probably sophomore year too.
And NOMA was started here in your senior year, or
my 5th year?
In your last year?
There had been a
in
chapter in the 90s. There was a alum, Brian West, and he was the first alumni that ever reached out to any of us as students. We don't even know how he got our information. He probably got it from Connie. So you guys should be friends with Kristen. But Connie Caldwell was Kristen before Kristen was. And he just emailed us all on our syr.edus one day and was like, hey, I'm Brian West. I graduated in the 90s. I want to connect. He had been really involved in NOMA in the 90s. And he was like, hey, I'm here for whatever you guys need. At the time, he worked for the Port Authority in New York City. And a lot of our alums and a lot of our current students at the time were from New York City. But also we had a lot of site visits in New York City. So whenever we were in New York City, if anyone from the Syracuse crew was in New York City, you could like go and meet him at Port Authority. He would get you lunch. He would come stop by and see us if we were out doing a studio tour. And so we had a really close relationship with Brian West as an alumni. He was really supportive. Unfortunately, he unexpectedly died at work one day my 3rd year. And so it was weird because he would check in like clockwork, like maybe once every 3 months. He was emailing you and saying like, how's your studio project going? Like, what's going on? You need anything? You need supplies? You need money? And like, it was just like, it had been like 4 months and we hadn't heard from him. And everybody was like, what's going on? Where is he? What's going on? And then one day Connie came and she said, I just heard from his wife and he passed. And everyone was like, what? And so really kind of after hearing that, this is when we started thinking about creating a formalized chapter and reaffiliating with National, kind of in his honor. It was something he had been really pushing us to do. I think also what helped is going into my 5th year, the NOMA National president that year was also a Syracuse alum and was really interested in seeing Syracuse more involved. So he started reaching out. And then we had a NOMA member from New York City, actually, who's really active in the New York chapter. He came up and visited for like some, student event that we had at Syracuse. He drove the 4 hours because he heard there were students in Syracuse that were trying to connect with New York professional chapter. That's the closest professional chapter to Syracuse. So I think like having that trifecta of an alum, the current president, who was also an alum, and then kind of an outside member investing and really interested in students. And, that's kind of what inspired us to start the chapter my last year.
And as you know, of course, you know better than I do, we've had some great results with, and I see some NOMA members on here with us tonight.
You mean the 2020 chapter of the year NOMAS members? Or the 2019 student competition winner NOMAS members? Which one did we
I
talk
meant,
about here?
I meant both. I meant, I meant both. Yeah, so yeah, we have a terrific chapter here, obviously now. So I want to move into just a couple of maybe more professional things, and then we can return to any of these topics. But I'm curious about your thesis, and also, I mean, not necessarily specifically, but I'm curious how soon you started to think about urban scale design, housing, community development. I know you went to Penn afterwards and you did a master's where you did some urban design and some urban planning. Had you already been thinking about that? Was that part of your thesis? How did you become interested in, let's say, that scale of project? And did you do that in your thesis? I'm curious.
Absolutely. So I would say very quickly, I was probably interested in these things before I got to Syracuse without knowing specifically what to call it. Um, I think I gravitated to urban topics even in like Terrence Good's theory classes. I really liked Mark Linder's class. I was one of those nerds for those of you that have taken theory semester two, year two theory. I was really into Linder's class, and I feel like he had a lot of readings that year on urbanism. At the time, Larry David, I don't know if he still teaches it, but he has a class that's kind of about housing, urbanism, and suburbs.
Yep.
And at the time, he doesn't teach at Syracuse anymore, but Lori Brown's husband taught at the time, and he did an architecture and city film class, which was very much looking at kind of like urban themes. And so I think across my electives, I had kind of honed in on a lot of kind of city scale and urban themed courses. I also did a minor in urban sociology, which is in the Maxwell School at Syracuse,
Mhm.
which also focuses on things that really at the city level, reading readers like Sonia Saska and, Elijah Anderson. So I think a lot of my research and a lot of my projects had always kind of been focused on more urban scale things. I did as much as I could. My thesis was actually, it was a tag team thesis. So I worked with, it was a partner thesis with another student from my class. We were looking at African American neighborhood infrastructure. So we started off analyzing the cities with the top 10 largest Black populations in the city, zeroing in on neighborhoods that had been historically majority Black, and then looking at their major commercial corridors to try to understand how African Americans inhabit space, but from a city scale. So kind of like thinking through the city at the Noli scale plan, but think if you're like using, fried chicken shacks and the barber shop and the hair salon and all of the other kind of commercial businesses that make up a typical commercial corridor, the same way you would look at a Noli plan. So then we each zeroed in on a city. My city was Washington, D.C. My partner picked Philadelphia, and we picked sites in predominantly Black neighborhoods that were kind of experiencing gentrification at the time, and picked sites that had really historic memories within the African American history of that neighborhood. And we were trying to put back, kind of using some of the spatial relationships that were created through other instances of urban like interaction throughout the neighborhood. So looking at things like the porch, the way like the stoop culture, hair salon culture, where you have this bleed between commerce, like, you've got the guys that come in off the street and are trying to sell you socks or oils or cookies, and like the little old lady that's selling cake slices, in these non-traditional spaces. And so it was interesting. My site was actually in the Shaw neighborhood, which is near Howard University, which has seen intense gentrification. I don't know if any of you watched that show on Netflix where they like go in and they make people's Airbnb. I think it's called like Spot. I forget the name of it, but they did an episode literally across the street from my site, and it is a very different neighborhood now. There's a new train station. There's a Target. There's a Starbucks. But at the time, they were at the beginning of this development and trying to figure out what they were going to do with this O Street Market site. The O Street Market was the historically slave market back in the day. It had been kind of an abandoned church that had just been derelict. And so we were repurposing it as a community center. funny enough, recently I found out through some things I was looking at work, Giant Grocery actually bought the site and has repurposed it as like a giant grocery and a condo tower. So in terms of scale, it actually now looks pretty similar to my thesis. It's like the exact same height and kind of urban footprint. Um, but I think leaving Syracuse, Syracuse is really great because I think we have a really broad education in a lot of topics. But I felt like I really wanted to know more about urbanism. A lot of the kind of scholars at the time for urbanism were at some of the other universities. They still, I mean, at GSAP, which is at Columbia University, and also at Harvard. And so I was like, I had learned from Randall Corman. He was like, you got to figure out the architects and the researchers that you're interested in, but then you got to go follow them, right? You have to go literally follow them to their institutions so that you can study under them. And so pretty quickly I was like, okay, I'm going to apply to grad school. I knew with the BArch I didn't need to, but I wanted to have the flexibility in the future in case I wanted to teach down the line, but also to kind of experience some of these other folks. At the time, Marion Weiss was at Penn, and my VC professor was actually teaching at Penn. And so he convinced me to apply to Penn. And Penn at the time was doing a lot of recruitment around diversity and inclusion. So it was great because I ended up getting a full ride to Penn. And then I went straight through, and for those of you that are graduating now or graduated last year, it was a very similar economic market in 2009. And so I thought it was probably wise to hide out for at least another year in graduate school, as opposed to kind of fight the market. That was right at the beginning of the 2008 crash. So it kind of worked out.
And you've been in Philadelphia ever since.
Time-wise. Yeah, I have.
So
It was
you,
nice.
I don't, you're cutting out just a little bit. I think we're back now. So, and then you've had, an incredibly distinguished career there, working with Housing Authority and Habitat, and you're now executive director of Community Design Collaborative. How do you go from grad school into, let's say, into this as a job, as a career path? How did that get started?
It's a good question. So when I was at Penn, the architecture department was very close. Like, so the way they did urban design when I was at Penn was it was half architecture, half planning. And so you could really take courses as a post-professional student, which is what they call anyone that already has a BArch. You could kind of take classes however you wanted across the two programs. And so at the time, Michael Arice, who wrote the Urban Design Reader, was teaching there at the time. So I took two of his classes, and Jonathan Barnett, who is like a great writer in planning. He was teaching all of our kind of workshop courses, and that's the planning equivalent to studio workshop. So we had a studio that was based on a real project looking in Florida at super regional competitiveness across the Central Florida region. And while it was looking at many things, it was looking at transportation, and we were looking at commercial pieces. The big piece in Florida was around connecting housing to transit. So it was really trying to think through things as transit-oriented development.
Yeah.
And our studio was really intense, but because it was a real client, and they had a work product. They were trying to campaign at the time, it was the Obama administration for Department of Transportation funds and so they were putting in a competitive proposal to the government to try to get these funds. And in that, we got to work with a lot of really big developers, folks from HDR and Jacobs and some of the like larger names that you know across the country. And a lot of the people that I was working with on my team were really into multifamily housing. And so I think early on, I realized like housing was a pretty major driver of other types of development in terms of what it catalyzes. And I had been interested in housing even at Syracuse, just at a different scale. So when I graduated, I was really looking for work in a firm that did residential. And I had done internships while I was at Syracuse for a lot of smaller residential architects in the summers in between school. So I felt like also a lot of my experience had already lended itself towards residential design. And so when I first got out of school, I was initially looking to work for like a CDC, working outside of architecture, but in a space where design kind of was necessary. And so I ended up working for a very small nonprofit community development corporation that was trying to get a real estate program off the ground. So really looking at like urban small infill lots, but also large redevelopment sites that they had that they were marketing to developers and working with politicians on to try to get them funded so that they could get them built. And I think at that point I realized so many projects um, need design intervention before they even hire the architect, right? Because the architect gets hired once a client already knows what they want to build. And oftentimes the client, with a very rare exception for architects, right, that can walk in and write their ticket, a client's coming to you, they already know how tall they want the building to be, they know how many units they want it to be. Half the time they know where they want the entrance, what kind of materials they want. And I thought that to be an architect and have our insight, but work on the other side of the table where you were kind of working for the owner, formulating what the architect was going to even be working on, was really a situation where you had a lot of power. And I knew that my design skills really helped me in that seat and in that, because I could draw things and I knew how big things were supposed to be, and I knew kind of materiality around certain materials that could be used for projects. And so I saw all of the ways that my architecture degrees really informed that side of the table. And so I kind of stayed on that side. A lot of my work, even at the housing authority, I was essentially an owner's rep.
Mm-hmm. I'm just a couple more questions, and maybe we'll turn it over to the audience and see if they have questions. Also, please post in the chat if you have any questions. It would be great to see some questions so that we can kind of go ahead and start to think about the kind of things you all are interested in speaking with Tya about. A couple of things. One is I know you've been teaching community development but you've also been teaching in real estate. Mm-hmm. And I know you were working, at least in one of the early firms you were involved with, maybe after you were working with the Philly Housing Authority, you were working in a real estate portfolio for a company. And real estate is such, we have a lot of students who are interested in real estate, and what's peculiar about that, I think, is or it's peculiar to a number of people outside the school and maybe even outside the profession, is that maybe 10, 15 years ago, if you say real estate to architecture students, they're like, forget it, sellouts. We don't want to hear that. We don't want to even have the conversation about real estate. And so students maybe 10 or 15 years ago just wanted to have nothing to do with it because they were idealistic and they wanted to change the world and change things. I think now students who are interested in real estate want to change things even more. They just know that it's very hard to do that without knowing something about and understanding the language of real estate. How do you feel about, I mean, we were talking about gentrification earlier. Obviously that's a challenge, it's an issue. It is about development, but wrong kind of development. Real estate, should we be interested in that? Should students get involved in that? What do you think about that?
Absolutely. I feel like to be an architect and know nothing about real estate, you don't know how to do your job, first of all. I don't know that it was that taboo when I was at Syracuse. We had Mark Norman, who ran he had a real estate course. When I was at Syracuse, it was really popular. You couldn't take it really until you were like a second semester, fourth year. It was really hard to get into. And so it was one of the most sought after electives. A lot of students when I was at Syracuse also did their minor in Whitman. So you had a lot of architecture students that were taking business classes at Whitman.
Right.
And so I think those two together already kind of led people in a direction, because when you try to put architecture with business, you kind of naturally end up in the real estate arena. I think additionally, Syracuse had the Upstate Institute when we were there, and like Julia Zerniak and a few other professors and a lot of visiting folks were there. And it was looking at this intersection of real estate and architecture. So I think when I was at Syracuse, real estate was always kind of part of the conversation. We had a lot of large site projects that were kind of tied to development sites that were happening in Syracuse. We moved to the warehouse. The warehouse itself was a real estate project and experiment. So I think real estate was a little more in vogue when I was at Syracuse. We also have a lot of really high-powered alumni, not necessarily from architecture, but at Syracuse, that have made serious impacts in the real estate world. So Jimmy Kuhn, who is, I think he's at Jones Lang LaSalle now, but he was very active as an alumni and had a lot of patronages. One of them was actually the architecture department. So a lot of times when you were, on studio trips in New York City, Jimmy Kuhn was involved. And so he was a real estate advisor. And at the time they were looking for they were recruiting pretty heavy from the architecture departments into real estate and like asset management programs kind of in New York and Boston. So I had a lot of classmates that ended up working also as owners reps or for real estate portfolios when they graduated as well. So I think that kind of was the zeitgeist of our time. I think it was a little different when I was coming out of school. In terms of being in Philly, I think it's hard to be an architect today and not engage the real estate world. Like, I think it's a lot more about the politics around how you get a project moving than it is kind of about the design details. I think you have different types of designers in offices, right? So you're going to have the person these days who's very tied into the technical side. And that could be technical from like they're really almost engineers and they're really doing more calculations. It could be the technical side where they're really dealing with platforms, right? So you might have a person that's your BIM manager that's handling, putting together a project in Revit and kind of coordinating on that side. But for the folks that kind of fall in the project, and then you've got the project designers, right? So you've got the designers that are literally sitting there with their pens and their pencils, and they're trying to kind of design what the aesthetic of the space looks like. But then you've got your project architect, right? And everybody knows the term project architect. For those of you that have taken ProPrac with Kirk Narberg, you will probably hear the term project architect. But once you get in the field, you realize the project architect is really coordinating all of the other people, right? They're working with your subcontractors, they're liaising with the engineers, they're making sure that the building process keeps moving. And that process very much engages real estate because it's tied to phases of the real estate transaction. And so I think there's many spaces where there's a point where they kind of overlap and they become almost the same process on the tail end of a project.
Right. Well, Kirk is still here. And so he's still teaching some of those classes. We actually moved a lot of the real estate to New York City when they opened the Fisher Center, which is, Fisher Brothers that's a real estate, it's a Syracuse alum real estate family. There's a Jimmy Kuhn lecture hall there. I saw Ifeoma, who's here tonight. She's teaching with us there and has been involved in a lot of things we're doing there. So we moved a lot of that activity to New York City, and so it continues. And I think it's probably still our biggest minor. I see we have some questions. I see Claire has a question here, and Akshin has a question. I want to ask you one more thing, and then maybe we'll start to have a little more interactivity with questions. You're executive director of Community Design Collaborative. What is Community Design Collaborative, and what does the executive director do? What's this new? Yeah, I know you just started, so what are you doing? What's Community Design Collaborative? What do you all do?
Great question. So how many of you have heard of AIA? Show of hands, or give a thumbs up. Okay, it's most of you. So in Philadelphia, our AIA chapter was really active in the 60s. And so What you don't learn much about in architecture school was that in the 60s, there was a big activist movement in the field, very similar to what's been going on today, where a lot of architects were trying to push back and say we should be more involved in equity, we should be more involved in neighborhoods. They started many things that we now know as neighborhood design centers, offshoots of like community groups that would be housed at universities or other large design-based institutions. In Philadelphia, they started what is now known as the Community Design Collaborative. And so it was a conduit for architects to volunteer their time and give pro bono design services to neighborhood projects and community-based projects. Many of the firms in Philly at the time were larger and weren't doing a lot of community-based work. So, independent nonprofit was started. It has almost always been run by an architect or someone in kind of adjacent to the field. My board is 97% architects. My volunteer, I have 1,000 architects, volunteers. Every large firm in Philadelphia pledges a certain number of hours a year, and then they get put on pro bono teams and then they go and they do feasibility studies for much smaller projects in communities. So it's not taking away work from architects. One, it's really good business development for the firms. It gets them in front of either nonprofits or markets that they didn't kind of know about. And two, since they're working on it at the feasibility stage, they're at the entry level of a lot of these projects. They're able to shape many of them and get some of the ongoing support to get the project up and running. When the program started, it was mostly focused on large affordable housing projects that were funded by the low income housing tax credits. These are usually 60 to 80 unit large projects. But that's a big undertaking for a lot of nonprofits that are mostly social service agencies. You're dealing with a lot of homeless service agencies or community-based organizations, and like they're just trying to get housing for their constituents. So my role of executive director, I'm really strategic vision, right? So I hire and I manage the staff, day-to-day operations, but I'm also strategic vision for long-term viability. So I've been here 6 weeks, and some of the things that I've already had to do is, so I wrote a $1 million grant. This kind of, I guess we're being recorded, so I guess now it's public knowledge, but I wrote a $1 million grant a couple weeks ago, trying to do a housing design competition around missing middle housing. So looking at tiny houses and how they apply in the Philadelphia context for zoning. And so if we get funded for that, it'll be an invited competition that allows 60 to 70 architecture firms across the country to submit designs for a built project that we would then gift to a nonprofit organization. We have been doing what we're calling design aid. So it's quick hit design service help for really small businesses and operations that are operating on Philadelphia's commercial corridors that have had to adjust their services due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So things like, your local Chinese food shop, right? That's really a takeout spot, but maybe they had 2 chairs on the inside, and that's where, local residents hung out all day and played checkers, right? And now pandemic happened, they've got to rethink how they're getting people in and out of the store. They've got to deal with spacing. They've also got to think about how they're social distancing and getting their workers in and out. So, right, they need a whole kind of like temporary setup to get in and out. We also work with our city's commerce department. So businesses that are on commercial cores that are applying for city grants or new signage would come and they'll get pro bono design services, sometimes even from design students, which is a redo of their facade. And so all of the city's facade improvements come through us. And then today we're actually working, I just like right before I jumped on this call, I submitted a proposal to the AIA. AIA has a thing called the Guides for Equitable Practice. So they came out last year. AIA wrote these guides to kind of advise architects on how they can be better at working in community contexts and using our concern as architects, but also, our ethics code requires that we're really focused on health, safety, and welfare, right? But the question for many architects is often, is it the health, safety, and welfare of the end user of your building, of your client, or of the greater public? Which is like, and what happens when those are competing interests? So they're looking for design teams. So it was supposed to be an architect, an academic institution, and an equity organization. Luckily, I'm 2 of those 3. That is going to put together a team to look at how do we take this and now make it tactical so that firms can actually apply it, right? How are they measuring it? What is equity? Is equity the same for a one person architecture firm? What does it mean when you're HOK and you have a nationwide, offices? So we just put in a proposal, so hopefully we'll get picked for that. And that would be putting together this tactical field guide and benchmarking system that
Wow.
architects would then use um, to measure equity on their projects. So we're kind of all over the place in a nutshell.
Exciting. A
But
lot happening. One more question, and then you can. There's some questions in the chat. One from Alexandra, one from Claire, one from Akshin. But my last question is, so Taya, do you need a master's degree to do this kind of work? Can our BArchs get involved in this kind of work? How do they do that? Where are the jobs? Are there internships? How do, if I'm interested now, what do I do? What do I do this summer?
it's a good question. So I think the first thing that you can always do if you want to be helpful is get as much practice in as you can, right? In most of these communities, they're looking for practical skills, right? They don't know space planning. They don't know how to read drawings, right? You have a lot of neighborhoods where the residents don't know what these renderings mean. They don't really even know how to engage their design consultant when the consultant's working on the project. They literally don't know what they're asking for. A lot of times it's also, thinking about how we translate information to the general public. Think about anytime any of you have tried to tell someone in your family about your studio project. What happens? Does people's eyes glaze over? Or their parents like look at your model and they just clap because they don't know what you're talking about. So I think a lot of it is starting to hone in on the skills, because there's one thing to talk to audience of peers and other architects. It's very different when you're trying to translate architectural ideas to the masses and make it so that it's universally understood. Um, and those skills come from working in an office and being on those projects. I think if you're really interested in community-based work, one of the best things you can do is volunteer. But most
Mm-hmm.
of these community organizations, when they do have community opportunities, they're looking for volunteer designers. They're looking for folks to sit in and run their charrettes, right? And so, yeah, they might have an architect that they're paying for, but the architect cannot sit at every table unless they're a really large firm. And even then, the firm is not sending everyone in the firm to run the charrette, right? They're going to send the 4 people on the project team in the office, and then they're going to get volunteers to come in and help. I think teaching youngsters, right? So in NOMA, we have Project Pipeline, but there's a myriad of programs that teach architecture to youngsters. You don't really need much. You just need, some Legos or some marshmallows and toothpicks and your church basement, right? So I think there's all types of different ways you can get involved. I think also staying in tune and what's going on in this sector of the field. It's a sector now, right? When I was in school, it wasn't. You had to kind of dig it out, seek it out.
Right.
It is now called public interest design or community development. You can go online and look it up now. And so I think it would be following those leaders of those fields, whether many of them are Instagram now. So you could follow them almost everywhere, getting on newsletters. There's a group called Enterprise. They have a program called the Rose Fellowship. Ifoma was actually a Rose Fellow. And they have a fellowship for architecture students that you can do. But AIA is starting to offer up a lot more opportunities in this sector as well. And there are now many, many other organizations that offer other types of internships. There's Rural Studio. Brian Bell has a lot of things through Seed. So there's like so many different opportunities now that didn't exist when I was in school that you can get involved with when you're still a student, which is
Okay, fantastic. So there's some questions there. I don't know if you want to take a crack at any of those, and people, if there are other questions, put them in the chat or raise your hand, and you can follow up and just directly ask Taya a question. But Taya, do you have, are any of those you want to take a crack at those?
Yeah, I can do all 3. I think they're all really
Okay.
good questions. So I'll go
Yeah, they are
backwards.
good.
So starting with Alexandra's question about sociology. So her question was I always interested in sociology or sociological issues, or was it something that came later? And was my initial love of architecture driven by architecture as an art, or architecture as a tool to change the environment community around it? Those are really good questions. My interest in architecture was definitely as the tool to change the environment and the community around it. One of the first things that really got me into my interest in architecture was reading and hearing on the news about how the city of Chicago was trying to deal with certain public housing sites in Chicago. I didn't live in public housing, but I lived a neighborhood over, and there was a large site that ended up getting redeveloped. You guys have all probably heard about it now. Um, but at the time, it's right near IIT's campus, and it abuts right up against um, a lot of famous architects' buildings. And so in one of my summer programs when I was in like first grade, actually, they took us to Crown Hall, and understanding and seeing the sharp difference between the context of the university campus and then this very poor majority black neighborhood that was right outside the campus, one that I wasn't actually even allowed as a kid to go to by myself. But it wasn't that far from my mother's office. My mom worked in social welfare. So I think in terms of sociology, I always saw sociology as kind of the closest thing to my mom's work in social work that was relevant to my work as an architect. I was also really interested in data. Sociology is where you're dealing with a lot of things like census data and maps. Wasn't really trying to do geographical studies. So sociology kind of became the space where a lot of my interests kind of met. And urban sociology very specifically looks at cities, right? So if sociology is the study of people, urban sociology is the study of cities and people in cities. And I was always really interested in cities. So finding out that urban sociology even existed as like a subset of sociology, and some of the foremost experts on urban sociology were at Maxwell and at Syracuse at the time. It just seemed like a really good fit. Another question: what kind of skills do you wish you had learned before or worked on before your first job? Everything. Oh my God. So my first, my first like job in architecture was after my third year at Syracuse. I was working for an alumni, Morgan Rollins in New York City. So I got to stay with some friends in New York City for the summer, which was really exciting. And he ran a really small practice. So it was him. He had just hired a recent graduate, and then it was me as the intern. And at the time, everything was in CAD. And so I felt pretty confident in my CAD work, but like all the things that he needed in terms of schedules, understanding components of houses, right? We don't learn a lot of that formally in school. Nobody's like quizzing you on like, what's a dormer? And like, what's this kind of outlet? And so I think both the terminology and shorthand for things outlets and how closets come together would have been something I would have really liked to have brushed up on. But the other thing was Excel, right? Because we don't use Excel a lot as students, and you don't use Excel a lot in architecture school. But hands down, the program that I've used the most as an adult professional has been Excel, Microsoft Excel.
Wow.
Yeah. So learn Excel now, guys. um, and then Axina, it's great to see you again too. A challenge I've loved taking on. So I think architecture really teaches you about problem solving. When most people like remark, oh, you're an architect, you have 2 architecture degrees, you're not working as an architect. Why do you work in community development, or why are you doing whatever you're doing? I always remind them like what architecture actually taught me how to do is problem solve. And that's really the greatest benefit that you leave architecture school with, is because we have a way of looking at the world and how things go together that's both visual, but it's also tactical and practical in a way that a lot of other fields are not looking at things that way. So we can analyze and break things down very quickly, which is something you don't realize in school, but that is really what studio is setting you up to do, right? Because if you think about it, just the thought that you're going to come into a studio, you're going to learn a site, you're going to analyze it, you're going to come up with a design, and you're going to detail that design in 16 weeks. it's pretty crazy in itself. So I think one of the greatest things to take away was that detail, being so detail oriented. Um, and so I feel like one of the obstacles that I had was um, I can get really in the weeds. I'm sure you can tell I'm very verbose, and I can explain my way out of anything, right? So architecture school taught me how to present to people. I could, like, once Richard Rosa once told me you could present a blank wall and probably get an A. But that doesn't always work at work, right? Because at work, people are trying to measure what it is that you did. They need to see it. And I think it's realizing that no matter how good you can be at drawing or even writing, not everybody can read the way you write, right? Or the way you draw. And I think it's being able to translate that for a variety of audiences and learning your audiences and learning how to present information multiple ways in the same presentation is probably the biggest obstacle, but that was rewarding because it forced me to really think every time I do a presentation, like, who's my audience? What do they need to know? How are they going to receive it? And then I can go back in and design it, right? Then I can go back in and play with colors and fonts and how big the picture is and what's the DPI. But like at the base, they have to get the base information. And like going back and like looking at everything through that lens has been really important and helpful. Let's see, what else do we have?
You kind of covered Claire's question, I think, or maybe you want to take that on too.
How do you find a look? Oh, Claire, there's been so many. Oh, yes,
I think,
skills. Oh, yeah,
yeah,
the skill was Excel. That was my skill. I answered Claire's question.
got it. I thought so. Yeah, got it.
um, yeah. See, Javier, how can I find a local organization that are seeking the kind of help that you've described with interpreting drawings? Well, one, I would say I would start with any organization in your neighborhood or city that is working on community capacity building, right? There are nonprofits all over cities that are doing community work, whether it's they're building schools, they're restoring community centers, they're trying to build playgrounds. Generally, you know, as the public person, you either know the city program that's pushing it, right? Or you know the architect because that's what's, or the developer because that's what's on the sign outside the construction site. But most of the programs that have a public kind of end use, right? So if we're talking in terms of program, they're generally operated by a nonprofit agency, and the nonprofit agency is the one that's funding the construction. And so generally, if they have a project going, they have other projects in the pipeline, and I would start there. Trying to figure out who's got projects going. Another really big place though to start is any religious institution in your neighborhood, right? Churches, masjids, synagogues, they all have real estate portfolios. Many of them are investing in real estate, but many of them also have a lot of land assets, and many of them are like trying to develop land assets. And they often need a lot of help because there's not a lot of architects. I don't know, those of you that might be Christian, I've never heard of like the architect ministry. So generally churches need a lot of help, and other religious institutions need a lot of help when they're trying to get projects off the ground. It's also a really good place to meet architects because they always tend to find some architect that's like, oh, I'm going to dedicate my time to this good cause. And it's a good way to find them. Idealist is also a really good source. And many of them are also gonna, when they're looking for those types of volunteers, they're gonna go now because they're gonna go to their local design school, or they're gonna go to their local AIA chapter and try to farm people through the programs. Because, you know, everybody knows if I want to find an architect, they go find an architecture organization and say, could you send this to all your members or your volunteers? I agree with Giselle. Excel and writing are really important. And I think writing's really important, right? Because I think in architecture school, especially if you came into Syracuse from a highly competitive high school, you often are able to place out of English classes. I know a lot of architecture students place out of English classes. And I know I did not have to take another English class at Syracuse University when I got to Syracuse. And so there's not a lot of writing that you're doing in classes, right? You know, like maybe you're writing reflections and maybe you have one research paper in your architectural theory classes, or, but you're not doing a lot of writing. So I would find and use opportunities in classes to hone your writing skills for sure. They're really important.
What about anybody want to turn your camera on and ask a question? Some people don't want to write a question. They have a question they have to ask in person. I don't see any. Tya,
you have someone, Leah just turned on her camera.
Oh, cool. Okay, good.
Hi. Sorry
Hi.
for the bad
Great.
lighting. My name is Leah. I'm a third year. I am also the president-elect for NOMOS for spring 2021. So nice to meet you. So I think a lot of the things that we are focusing on as a new e-board moving forward is how to really expand our reach as NOMOS. I don't know if you've heard about this. This is there's a part, like sort of a sub branch in NOMOS that was just created called FDS, Future Designers of Syracuse. So they are reaching into communities at the moment in the nearby area and trying to connect with people in communities, possibly teach classes, reach out to people there. I think that we're very much interested in uplifting the community around us right now. So what would you say is do you have any advice for us moving forward as a NOMA alum, or ways or places or people that we should be targeting at the moment, in your opinion?
No, absolutely. I think that's great. I think communities are really looking to engage, and there's a lot of resources. Up on the hill at Syracuse, like, we're very resourced, and I'm sure you've all looked around and noticed that very quickly, once you get off campus, it's a very different situation in some of the surrounding communities close to the university. And when I was at Syracuse, I feel like there was like a lot of pressure in kind of marketing, and I don't think it was direct. I think it was indirect marketing, right, to students that was like, stay on campus. It's safer on campus. Don't go off campus. And so I thought one of the things that was really great when I was at Syracuse is that you did not get that from the architecture school, right? Your architecture professors would be like, go off campus, go look at buildings, go to your site. So I think we got a few additional opportunities to go and see other parts of the city. We did a lot of work when I was at Syracuse with some high school programs. So we did a program with Fowler High School, and we did a program with Nottingham High School, where we went in as students through someone that worked at Syracuse that also recruited at those high schools that was from the city. And we did a lot of career days, right? So we did a lot of career days. We did a lot of design projects that we would do, like whether it was with their physics class or with their art class, depending on their age group. I think that was a really great start. I would see what professors at Syracuse are working already in some of these communities. Many of them already are. At the time that I was at Syracuse, we probably had 3 or 4 professors, because they live in Syracuse. Like, they're full-time professors, they live in Syracuse. So their practice is in Syracuse, right? Their projects are often in Syracuse. So a lot of them have these clients, right? I know Lori Brown had worked before with the fertility clinic that's in Syracuse. It's one of the largest in the country. We had a professor that was here at the time that was working with the Community Folk Art Museum when I was at Syracuse, and had done a lot of work with that group. And that was a primarily African-American focused cultural institution. Sekou Cook is doing a lot of work in Syracuse. He's done a co-op, and he's has a few other projects. I know Ataka Show has done a lot of projects in Syracuse. So, like, you have professors that already have clients and already have these connections to a lot of these groups in Syracuse. Seek them out. See, do they need help on their projects? Do they have opportunities for students, maybe at the beginning of a new project that you can get on? Do they have internship opportunities or volunteer hours they can throw you guys? The good thing is you can get IDP hours, which many of you are probably not paying attention yet to the architecture experience program, but it is the hours that you need to complete to be able to sit for your licensure exams. And there are many of them. There's 5,800. So, there's not many that count towards volunteering, but I'll say as many as you can get done when you're in school is all the better when you're on the other side of that line, because when you're working in a firm, you're not necessarily guaranteed to get all of them. And some of the ones that are easier to get as a student, like some of your volunteer kind of flex hours, are a lot harder to get when you're working, because that's stuff that you would have to do on your own time, as opposed to doing at work. I think the other thing is to remember that these are living, breathing communities, right? These people have lived experience. And while they might need a capacity, support, and help, they are not stupid, right? I think a lot of times, sometimes architects come into neighborhoods and act like design is an elite thing that we learned, right? It's because we spent 5 years in school and countless sleepless nights in studio. We think it's precious. No one else can understand it. But I always tell people, remember, every human being lives their life in buildings. So like, while we might know details about buildings, every human being understands space. And there's nothing you can do when you go into someone's house is tell them how they're living in it and tell them how, so don't go in and tell people how they're going to live better, because many people have already figured out how to survive in their own space. And they've probably figured out things that we as architects would never have even thought of or would default to. And so going graciously remembering that as much as you've got to bring, you've got to learn. And it's an exchange of information. I know a lot of neighborhoods, it's really hard when planners and architects come into their neighborhood, because it's often, they feel overstudied, right? They feel like zoo animals. They feel like you come in, you're so eager, you want to design this thing for them, you don't really listen, you take all of their information, you give them a piece of paper and a pretty picture at the end, and then you leave, and you're gone. And they're stuck with a picture, and they're trying to figure out, what does this mean? Like, one, they can't read the picture half the time. And then two, they have to figure out the next steps. And a lot of times architects aren't super great at the next steps. And we act like we gave them this like really great gift and we really just gave them their next challenge. And they needed the next challenge. So like, it's not that they are generally very appreciative, but it's a hard relationship to learn, because it's very different than our socialization to projects as students. And so I would just say, proceed with care, because a lot of these communities, they're dealing, and remember, like, they're dealing with very real life things, right? When we're talking quality of life, and I'm sure many of the things that have happened this year have made us realize all of the things that are greater than architecture still are facilitated and happen through the built environment. So coming in and telling somebody how you're going to save their life, right, through the design of a space that costs money to build when they're suffering from coronavirus and their neighborhood's been disinvested for many, many, many years, and maybe they're unemployed right now. Like, sometimes we just have to give the thing and not try to solve all of their problems, because there's no way, there's certain things cannot be solved by architecture. And that's also a hard lesson to learn.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. Thank you so much.
Dean Speaks, I think you're on mute.
I was mute, sorry. Tya, we don't want to keep you all night. We appreciate enormously your time. Anything you want to say, any closing, parting advice, anything you want to say about school now, work now? And we hope we'll be able to engage you again in some more conversations and connection over time. I mean, this was a great opportunity for us to all, spend a little more time with you. But anything to say in closing?
Yeah, no, definitely. So one, you're a lifelong student, right? You don't stop learning at Syracuse. You guys can't see, but I have like 40 architecture books just under this camera, right? You can see behind Pete's head is what my house looks like all the time. And so I think you have to remember that you are always a student, right? You're always learning, and there's always more to know. There's never, like, to this day, I graduated from architecture school 11 years ago from Syracuse, right? I still have more to learn. I have only touched the iceberg. And so there's so much to learn. If you take one class and you don't like it, or you find one professor and you don't get along with them, don't let that be the thing that makes you think that that's the entire field. This field is vast. This field is diverse. There are so many things you can do with your architecture degree. Find the thing in architecture that is exciting to you, the thing that's going to drive you, because it's vast. Like there's so many things like that. You'll find a thing in architecture that you're into. Like a lot of times we get caught up in school and like this process of getting our grades and finishing one studio project. I think also use your resources, right? The resources will never be as good as they are when you are a student. I want you to remember this, right? Because I think students take for granted the resources that they have. Get all of the licenses that are either free or low cost now, right? Learn the tools while they are $30 or $0 to get, while you can use your SYR and get a Autodesk login and test everything. Because when you get out of school, they charge you $250 a year to keep it up. And I'll tell you the first thing when you are young and you are broke that you stop paying for are all of these licenses, right? And then you're only stuck with what you have at work. And depending on where you work, you're not going to have every license. Also, books, right? Barbara's here. This is a great plug. I worked at the reading room for all 5 years that I was at Syracuse. There are so many books in that library. Go use them. Use all of them because one, they're expensive. Some of them you don't even know, but they cost a lot of money. You will not ever buy that. You will never own it because you can't afford it. And so use the time to research, read the magazines, read the books, figure out what architects you are interested in and study them. This is our field, right? You got to figure out who are your people. Your people might not be Peter Eisenman. And I know to go to Syracuse and like discover that, you'll feel like a weird outcast, right? But it might not be Peter Eisenman. He's a great guy though, by the way. But if he's not, that's fine because there's other people, right? There's so many people. And so figure out who you like and learn about them and then try to go study under them or meet them. Like that's your next step. And realize that you're at a university that puts you in a much better position to do that than if you were at many other schools.
Wow. Okay. Well, we, our favorite is Tya Winn. So we appreciate enormously spending some time with us tonight. Everybody help me give some applause to Tya. Thank you. Thanks for coming tonight. So we will be back in touch. We will see you again sometime soon. I'm going to thank everybody for coming tonight. Kristen, thanks for setting all this up. Thanks especially to Tya, and thanks to those who asked questions. Was a fabulous conversation, and we look forward to more with you, Tya. And yeah, thank you. We'll let you go.
Great.
We've had you for an hour 15.
I'm on LinkedIn, so if any of you want to find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm definitely in the Syracuse Architecture Alumni Group, so I'm there. Also, I don't have any internships now, but I know I'm on the board of AIA locally in Philly. And so I always have access to internships when internship times come. It might not be with me, but I can put your resume on somebody's desk and guarantee you at least an interview at most of the firms in Philly. So remember that and call me when you're ready.
Thank you. We will be in touch.
Welcome.
Thank you again,
Have
Tya.
a good evening, everyone.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Bye.